and identify important resources that are available to help you get an efficient, effective rack storage system. Arlen Keck is corporate engineer with Steel King Industries. He joins us now at our Global Spec E event. Arlen, welcome. It's good to have you with us.
Oh, thank you, Jim. Glad to be here. What I'm going to be talking about in this session is industrial steel storage racks. And I think the best way to illustrate this is to show you some slides. And we'll start out with a few simple definitions just so we're all together during this session here. This first slide actually shows a warehouse and a home center. And this is where most industrial steel storage racks are used. This next slide actually shows you a wooden pallet. When product is put on this pallet, then it is referred to as a unit load. The pallet you see here in the picture is referred to as a GMA, or Grocery Manufacturer Association's pallet. It basically is 40 inches wide by 48 inches deep. The loads on this pallet usually range from about 2,000 pounds to 3,000 pounds on the average. There are heavier loads, and of course there can be lighter loads. This next slide shows forklift trucks. Forklift trucks come in a variety of sizes and capacities, and actually they're a whole presentation in themselves. The most common forklift, though, is the one shown in the upper left-hand corner, which is referred to as a counterbalance forklift. Another term we'll be using a lot during this presentation is service or traffic aisles. This happens to show this slide here shows a selective rack, and you'll notice that the aisle going down between the rows of rack. This aisle is referred to as the service aisle or traffic aisle, and this is the aisle that the forklift will travel when loading and unloading product from the rack. Most manufacturers of industrial steel storage racks offer two styles of racks, as shown in this slide. The one on the left-hand side is referred to as boltless rack or roll form rack, and is usually made from coil or sheet steel and then run through a roll forming process. The rack on the right-hand side is usually referred to as structural rack or bolted rack, and is usually made from structural channels, structural angle, and or tubes. The difference between the two is that the boltless rack can usually be connected without the use of too much hardware. In the structural rack, most of the components are connected having to use a bolt and nut combination. This next slide here actually shows single deep selective rack. This is the most common type of rack out there. It also, unfortunately, consumes the most amount of floor space because the rack and the aisle, the rack has to be serviced from one aisle. It does offer 100% selectivity. It is commonly used for general merchandise storage and or food storage. And like I said, it is the most common rack generally found out there. This next slide illustrates what they call double reach rack. It is very similar to the single deep selective rack, but actually what you have here is two single deep rows of selective rack put in a back-to-back fashion. It doubles your storage. Unfortunately, only 50% of the slots are open at one time for picking, and it does require a special double reach forklift to operate it. But it does increase your storage per square foot of warehouse floor space. This next slide shows what is called hand stack rack. Hand stack racks are like selective racks, except that the product is basically hand loaded onto the shelf or unloaded from the shelf. They can either be serviced and be a shorter style, like the one shown in the picture where they're just serviced from the floor itself, or for the taller systems there is what they call a rider aboard truck, in which the driver of the truck actually rides up the mast of the forklift along with the product and does the picking. For this type of rack, because your containers are so small, they're usually boxes or cartons or totes or something like that, there needs to be a decking material placed between the front and rear beams. This drawing here, this slide here, illustrates basically what you'd call an engineered wood product, but other ones used are wire decking, plywood, or even a solid or punch corrugated decking or other common decking materials for this type of rack. This next slide illustrates dock door racks. Dock door racks again are a special form of selective racks, except they're located over the dock doors of a warehouse and are usually used for storing empty pallets. Because of the high traffic area, in these areas, you do have to have special safety accessories and impact resistance accessories. It also is dependent on being held up a lot of times by the building structure. In the top left-hand slide, you'll picture of the slide, you will see the storage racks attached to the building columns, and the one on the right-hand, upper right-hand side, you'll actually see the racks hanging from the roof ceiling. Both of these, the loads themselves have to be taken to the designer of the building to confirm that the building is designed to absorb these kind of loads. This next slide actually shows die storage racks. Die storage racks are really a robust form of selective rack. And unlike the standard selective rack, which may be found in a home center environment or a warehouse setting, these kind of racks are usually located in an industrial environment, basically an assembly or fabrication plant, and generally near a heavy-duty industrial press. And on these kinds of racks, they normally store the dies that are used within that press. Most of the time, the decking on the shelves are either a heavy-duty steel solid shelf, or sometimes they just run a riser bar front to rear and basically set the dies on those. Your loads on these kind of racks can get pretty high at times. 10,000, 15,000, 20,000 pounds of shelf load are not unusual. This next slide shows drive-in racks. Drive-in racks are a very good form of high-density storage racks. Their only one drawback really is that the only pallet position that is really available for picking at any one time is the very front position on any level. But they can be serviced from the same aisle. Normally, one of the other drawbacks is that the first pallet in happens to be the last one out in a drive-in rack application. In a drive-through rack application, which has to use two service aisles, the product put in first is picked first, but from the back side of the rack. Again, it's good for food storage, general merchandise, a lot of times in freezer and cooler applications. It's a very common rack. You notice that this rack consists of upright frames. On the top are horizontal stabilizing beams. Then you have basically what they call the arms on the foremost frames, and on the back there could be horizontal or tie beams in the back frame there. And then there's this load rail that runs parallel with the upright frames in the direction of travel, and that is actually what the product is set upon. This next slide illustrates what is referred to as pushback racks. They again offer high density storage just like drive-in and drive-through racks. It does have the problem that the first pallet in is also the last pallet taken out. Like drive-in racks, pushback racks are ideal for a batch storage in which the number of pallets put in a single individual bay is equal to the number of pallets that bay can hold. There are some advantages though of pushback racks. One of the advantages is it can handle pallets that may be damaged. Damaged pallets can really create a lot of problems on drive-in racks, but these can handle pallets that may have a little damaged condition. They're much stronger for seismic conditions. If you have a warehouse located in a high seismic region or earthquake region, they offer much greater structural stability than a drive-in rack. And thirdly, they usually have a quicker throughput time for loading pallets and taking out pallets because you're always working from the service aisle. The way it works is once a pallet is put on position on one of these carts, when the next pallet is brought forward to load onto the rack, you just push the other pallet backwards and you keep loading in that fashion. The lanes for pushback rack can handle anywhere from 2 pallets deep to 6 pallets deep. When you start unloading pallets, it's kind of the reverse of the loading operation. As you take off one pallet, the next pallet or cart flows forward to the service aisle. So that's what causes for the decrease in throughput time versus drive-in racks. This next rack is referred to as pallet flow rack. Pallet flow rack, carton flow rack, and pushback rack form a group of racks that are usually referred to as dynamic storage just because the products move within the rack and are not just sitting there. In pallet flow rack, the advantages are the first product put in can be the first product taken out because you load from one end of the rack and you unload from the other end of the rack. Pallet flow racks range from 2 pallets deep to over 12, as you can see from this slide. They can get relatively deep. They're an excellent rack to use where first in, first out product rotation is very important, such such as in a food processing plant or something like that, one of those kind of environments. The one place that pallet flow racks do not really work real well is in freezer applications. In there, because of the cold temperatures, there can be hang up between the pallets and the wheels themselves, and flow is not always the greatest. This next slide shows carton flow rack. Carton flow is very similar to pallet flow, except that instead of storing palletized loads, you store individual cartons or boxes or totes. Normally all the loading is done by hand, and therefore a typical rack is not much more than 8 feet tall. That's including the stabilizing beams at the top. Basically, like pallet flow, you load from one side of the rack and the product flows forward, and you unload from the other type of rack. Loads can range into 25 pounds a square foot. These racks are ideal for small parts storage or picking, such as small parts for automobile plants or shops, cigarettes, cosmetics, anything where you have broken down in small items. The flow lanes themselves can either be resting right on the rack beams, or in some cases there are manufacturers of the carton flow lanes that actually make a welded shelf assembly that actually attaches directly to the upright frames and eliminates the shelf beams. This next slide shows cantilever rack. I believe most of you are familiar with cantilever rack from going to your local home center and seeing the wood storage or pipe storage or something like that in your home center. And that's very common applications. They're great for storing large size items, unbundled items, or non-palletized items, or irregular shaped items. This slide here basically shows what they would call a heavy-duty cantilever rack. But there are lighter forms of cantilever rack, and one of the best examples is for furniture storage in warehouses, where you have a lot of irregular shapes. You would lose a lot of space if you try to put these things into a selective rack, because it's kind of hard to match the product up with the shelf size. And like I said, that's one of the most common applications for a light-duty cantilever rack. This next slide shows what is referred to as a pick module. Pick modules are highly engineered systems. They usually consist of either selective rack, or pushback racks, or pallet flow racks, or carton flow racks, or combinations of them. And in between these rows of racks, there are elevated working floors or picking floors that basically tie the whole system together. And these are where the workers are at. Not only do you have your typical accessories like your upright frames, your shelf beams, and your pushback and flowback lanes, but you have a variety of accessory components that you can see from some of these pictures. You'll have stairways, you'll have handrail, you'll have gates for pallet drop-off zones, you'll have the flooring, the lights have to be worked into the system, a lot of the other electrical things are tied into the system. There'll be kick plates and handrails, and you'll often see at the center of one of these systems, I think the photograph in the upper right does the best of illustrating that, you will see what they call the central or principal pick aisle. And down this pick aisle there usually is a powered conveyor system, and what they do is they pick product from the rack and put it on this powered conveyor, and the powered conveyor takes the product out to a sorting area where it's matched with other components. The whole concept of a pick module is to take a pallet load of a similar product and to break that product into smaller components so that the smaller components can be repackaged up and sent to individual stores. Because basically you would not want a full pallet load of one product going to one store because they wouldn't sell it. But this allows you to break them apart and repackage them. And that's the whole purpose of these systems. The next slide here shows what is called portable racks. Portable racks